Hi, this is Chuck,
And this is Karen.
and this is our show, What If It Really Works? A practical guide to spirituality. And look who we have today.
We have Dr. Richard Tarnas, and Clay is going to tell us a little bit more about him.
What an exciting day it is, because Rick, this is the first time that you and I've met, and I've been doing a little bit of reading and studying, preparing for this. I understand that you're the founding director of the graduate program in philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness at the California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco. And a highlight that I see is Esalen Institute. I guess you were there for about 10 years or so.
That's right.
Worked with Stanislav Grof, Joseph Campbell. I believe there was a fellow, Jim Beal from NASA, that was there that you may or may not have known. Two books that I'm into right now are yours, and I'm savoring them. The first one, The Passion of the Western Mind, Narrative History of Western Thought. And the other one is Cosmos and Psyche. And I read it like this. I go, read 10 pages, go back 9, read 10 pages, because it is, both of them are so rich with history and insights and perspectives that I'm thoroughly enjoying them. So, Richard, welcome.
Thank you, Clay. Thank you. It's an honor to be here, and I appreciate the generous introduction. That's just how I read my favorite books, which tend to be on the richer and denser and larger size. And like two of them recently, like Charles Taylor's Sources of the Self, mm-hmm. and Robert Bella's Religion and Human Evolution. Both, each one's a magnum opus that came out in their last as really senior scholars, and you can just read it right through. But that second, kind of circling back and taking it in, that's how I integrate deeper thinking and make it where it starts to live in me more and starts to be more integrated with the rest of my thinking. And yeah, I'm very much a believer in that kind of close reading. And I see right next to you there on
just happen to have them. Yeah. If I were to open them up, you would see that there's highlighted and there's drawings and there's notes. And I'm reading them both at the same time. That's the other thing that helps me integrate, is to have two rich, like your two books here, have them going at the same time. And you can't be in a rush, nor do I want to be in a rush as I'm going through them.
Right. They aren't, you can't speed read them, and they weren't speed written.
No.
For sure.
The way the Pisces think too, Richard, is like, I'm the same way about books, and I keep several by my bed, and I'll read this one, and then I read some of this, and then I come back and read that all over again, and because it helps me to absorb it all, just to put it into context with everything else.
Yes.
So we're just so delighted you're here with us today, and we want to hear everything you're up to and tell us about what's going on.
Well, I'll be happy to speak with you about the whatever particular direction you point me in. I'd be very happy to discuss with you. Thank you.
I'd like to jump right into the hard part of that. On an interview that we saw that you did recently, you talked about how the stars relate to us and how they can change us, and you compared the influences, not, as I used to say 60 years ago, the stars don't compel, they impel, or stuff like that. But what you were talking about was that the relationship is like a breath. That when that part of the universe where those stars are breathes out, we breathe out with it, and we breathe in. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, and I think there's truth in that ancient saying about the stars do not compel, they impel. It's a different way of getting at some of the same perspective that I'll try to sketch out here. But the idea of bringing in the breathing it comes from the ancient Neoplatonic philosopher Plotinus, really one of the greatest of the ancient philosophers, and he was the philosopher who both founded Neoplatonism, but he brought about the first great synthesis of Plato and Aristotle, and then in turn was an enormous influence on the evolution of Western philosophy after that. Really, much of European medieval scholastic philosophy is shaped by him, and even in our own 20th century, we have. I mean, it was our century, the four of us here for sure. That the last century had figures like James Hillman, who an archetypal psychology that was very much shaped by Plotinus. So Plotinus was arguing on two fronts, which is maybe not unfamiliar to our own position today. And that is, on the one hand, he was arguing against those who had a completely disenchanted worldview. The universe was mechanistic. It lacked any soul. The movements of the stars and planets were, did not have deeper meaning, certainly not deeper meaning for humanity. And so he was, on the one hand, wanting to counter that disenchanted cosmology. And on the other hand, he was wanting to counter a certain orthodox astrological view, which looked at the planets and stars, sun and moon, as essentially in a kind of mechanistic, linear way, causing human beings to act in a certain way, for their fate to be determined in a kind of externally defined way. And both that disenchanted view and the let's call it a deterministic, fatalistic view within astrology, both of those were countered by his view that really he said the stars, the planets across the heavens, they in some sense they're like a language that is speaking from the deeper soul of the cosmos, the anima mundi, the soul of the cosmos. And he said, all things are full of signs, and everything is interconnected. And then he used this beautiful phrase. He said, everything breathes together. Everything breathes together. And
that's so special.
It really is. And he captured, and we all have a sense where, just think about how the collective psyche, the zeitgeist, has certain common features that we're all breathing now. We're all swimming in. We're all participating in a collective, let's call it an archetypal gestalt that is shaping our deeper impulses and perceptual categories and so forth, and our moods and so forth. So, and when he uses something like breathing together, he's pointing towards a form of a kind of like holistic, underlying holistic unity in things, which in a sense is a form of causality. It's a kind of holistic causality rather than a billiard ball, one thing hitting the other, linear, mechanistic.
That's such an important point, and it was in reading your material that it kind of dawned on me. I always thought that when the people looking at the astrological impacts of things, that it was the gravity of this planet and the gravity of that planet and those having that impact on us. That's what you're referring to as the mechanistic. And you're saying that's not what we're talking about here.
Right. I mean, there's just too many signs that type of causality is not at work. For example, the distance of the planet or the size of it is very much unrelated to its potency, as evident in our lives. And in addition, there's a kind of archetypal, what I call multivalence, a kind of rainbow spectrum of potentialities that any given archetypal combination, any given planetary aspect, like a Sun-Neptune conjunction or a Moon-Venus opposition, these are going to have, there's not just one way they come through, in the same way that when you have a certain, you bring a particular substance to a certain temperature, and then there's going to be a certain predictable result. That's one form of causation, but this is much more multivalent. It's much more creatively open to multiple ways of becoming enacted. And one of the things that seems to play a large role in how a particular planetary alignment is enacted is the level of consciousness that is brought to the energies involved, and that suggests a much more subtle form of causation. And then when you combine it with Jung's idea of synchronicity, which I think Plotinus's description of everything breathes together and all things are full of signs, is a perfect ancient rendering of what Jung was getting at with his notion of synchronicity. That when we have the woman who's a patient has this powerful dream about a golden scarab jewelry being given to her in the dream, and Jung is listening to it. This is a woman who's been kind of resistant to feeling that there were deeper meanings in things, but he was kind of just going with it, hoping that there'd be a shift. And at this point, she shares this dream that she'd had the night before about this golden scarab jewelry being given to her. And Jung, of course, is thinking golden scarab, deep mythic symbol coming from ancient Egyptian cosmology. And at that moment, though, there's this tapping at the window, it's kind of light, insistent tapping, and he goes to the window, opens it up, and brings in a what looks just like a golden scarab insect, the closest, as he put it, it's a form of rose chafer, from the family of scarab beetles, closest that you could get in Switzerland to the ancient Egyptian golden scarab. And he brings it in, and he opens his hand and says, and here is your golden scarab. And that produced a kind of wow feeling for her. Like, geez, there's more going on. I mean, she couldn't rationalize it, which was her normal tendency. She couldn't go, there must have been somebody out there waiting for me to just tell this dream, tap on the window, and they had this golden scarab ready just in case, out of their range if possible. That type of reasoning quickly collapsed of its own weight, and she opened up to the fact that, in a sense, more was going on in life than she had accounted for, and there seemed to be something in the very nature of reality, in the very nature of nature, of the outside world, that was somehow in league with, or supportive of, or coherent with her own deep psyche's processes. That there was an inner-outer coherence, and that's the synchronicity that Jung was talking about, and that is the quality of breathing together.
Mhm.
That's so rich. That's so rich. It's this idea that when something like that happens, I know for me, the first thing I find meaning in it. That this means something, and the same thing could happen to somebody else. They would have a different meaning.
That's right. Synchronicities seem to be rather specifically contoured for the individual in question. And a lot of times it's so carefully contoured that it is difficult to convey to somebody else exactly why a synchronicity is as meaningful to that person as it is. You would have to basically have this whole range of experiences, certain emotional responses to particular memories and so forth. All these things would be, it's much like dreams where, you know, the dreams, they use symbols that are going to be relatable to other particulars in that person's life that somebody else would not, even if they had those particulars listed out for them, it wouldn't have the affective meaning. It would just, they would just see, well, yeah, sort of, I kind of, but for this person, these might happen to be deeply meaningful particulars, and it creates an overall narrative. This is something you see in many great novels and plays and so forth. There'll be coincidences that unfold in the narrative, and that's pretty true to life. It's not just a construct of the writer.
Yeah. So the coincidence is a coincidence with meaning behind it becomes a synchronicity. I think that's
Exactly.
what I'm hearing. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. It's a meaningful coincidence, and what makes it meaningful is the coherence between what is happening in the outside world and what's happening inside. Or in the case of astrology, which Jung sometimes suggested can be seen as a kind of cosmic scale version of synchronicity, you can have the outer is being carried by the movements of the planets and the stars and so forth, and the Earth creating these particular alignments as they move through their different orbits. And you can get a Saturn-Pluto conjunction, such as we've been going through the last year or so. And then you could have, it's true that there can be many interiorly experienced events that are carried by that same archetypal complex of the Saturn and Pluto together. Things like, a deep sense of the gravity of current history, of feeling locked in, feeling like one can't breathe, actually. I can't breathe, that poignant outcry from so many during this past year, with its many meanings, both literal and existential. And these are kind of classic expressions of certain parts of the Saturn-Pluto complex, that Saturn, the contraction, the constriction, all of us locked in our houses, the pandemic seclusion that we are having to be in, etc. And then the Plutonic intensifies all that to just tremendous degree, but also is making the contraction, putting it in service of a larger transformational project. So there's usually a dying as well as the potential for a real regeneration. And that's the key to this.
Yeah, I want to pick up right there because that is such an important point. And it kind of goes back to what you were talking about earlier. I don't remember the term, but this is an opportunity where so many of us, me included at times, have this helpless, hopeless feeling. You know, the planets are aligned and this is big tumultuous time is happening here and I'm a victim. Well, no, there's another side to that too, as I'm understanding.
Yes, indeed.
Mm-hmm.
So every archetypal combination, every planetary aspect has its noble potential as well as its shadow side. And I think this is actually something that more astrologers would do well to integrate, this deep truth, because it would help their clients when they're giving readings and their own perception. If they don't divide the planetary meanings into positive and negative, or good aspects and evil aspects, as they used to be called, or just benefics and malefics, in a kind of simplistic, even masculine, feminine, because every single one of the great planetary archetypes, and the solar and the lunar, have masculine and feminine dimensions. You can have the solar feminine, you know, the bravely autonomous woman who is, you know, she's carrying her full womanhood at the same time being an individual and radiantly expressing her creative individuality in a typical solar way, while there can be a lunar masculine man who is able to be in touch with his feelings, to be very relational, these aren't, if we say lunar is just feminine and solar is just masculine, even though astrologers for years have said, well, they are in both men and women, but you're still defining it a little much as more that the lunar is really feminine, but men need to kind of integrate that. But if we see that the lunar masculine is an essential part of their masculinity, and if we see that the solar autonomous dimension of a woman is essential to her womanhood, to her femininity, and not just a kind of masculine addition, supplement to be healthy, then you get a different reading. So all of the aspects, all of the planetary archetypes and their combinations, such as the planetary aspects like the square, opposition, they all have wonderful potentials, as well as, you know, potentially self-destructive or very problematic ways of expressing themselves. So in the case of the Saturn-Pluto aspect, yes, it is one of the hardest aspects during eras that have, like, the Saturn-Pluto in hard aspect. You know, our last opposition happened right at 9/11, and that whole sense of, you know, tremendous historical contraction and gravity, and we're under threat, and we're victims of overpowering forces, etc. Both world wars began right under Saturn-Pluto in tight, hard aspect. The 1914 conjunction for World War I, then the square in 1939, and so forth. It's I've sketched out how systematic it is in Cosmos and Psyche. But at the same time, Saturn is not just that which contracts and oppresses or brings us into a hard encounter with the end of things and with the heaviness of life. It is all those things, but Saturn is also that which gives us backbone, that which gives us the wisdom of experience, that which gives us the capacity for mature discernment. It's what gives us discipline, the capacity to work hard at something hour after hour, year after year, building gradually over time. Remember, Saturn is also time. Those certain things can only take place in the fullness of time. And whenever Pluto comes into alignment with anything, it always intensifies it to, you know, volcanic degrees. So Pluto with Saturn is giving us both this, as it usually does, very kind of grave historical kind of crisis, contraction, divisions. There can be apocalyptic feelings that can come up. And at the same time, it gives, you see this in the charts of people who have been unusually capable of taking on the responsibility of their historical moment and bringing tremendous concentrated focus and hard labor and discipline into essentially birthing a new reality. And that's the other side of Saturn Pluto, is that it is the aspect of the hard labor of birth. It's both the it has both a dying to the past, the end of an era, very typical feeling. That sense that we're in a historical crisis that we will never forget, which I think everybody will look back at 2020 and will have no problem remembering this year as being distinctive for many reasons. But it can mobilize tremendous efforts on behalf of a noble cause, where one works very hard to, often facing the shadow, facing the hard aspects of life, the mortality, suffering, evil, really looking at it and becoming able to come into relationship to this historical crisis with greater courage and awareness and discernment. So it's every single alignment has both that light and shadow potential, and I try to emphasize that.
You talk about the initiatory rite of passage, and that, I think that's coming to mind for me right now, and I seem to recall it was as though a person has got to be pushed, or a culture or people have got to be pushed to the brink. They've got to just, to the brink of death to really affect change, for change to happen. Some of the business books are, we don't change until we have to, but this is kind of that on steroids.
And you see, the initiatory rites of passage are they're rituals that go back in human history as far as we can trace it. Virtually all societies that we know of prior to the modern had very deeply important initiations and rites of passage that were central to their societies. Ours has been unusual in that respect, and I'll say something more about that in a minute. But if you look at the major qualities, the features of an initiatory rite of passage, whether it took place in an indigenous culture in Native America, or in Africa, or the Australian Aborigines, or whether you are looking at the ancient mystery religions like the Dionysian or the Eleusinian mysteries in Hellenic culture, for example, Greek culture, and classical antiquity. In all those cultures, you would have an experience that was where there was a deep, basically there would be a separation of the individual from the larger community, separating maybe the young boys or the young girls from the mothers, and then putting them through a kind of crucible of transformation that was no joke. It could be very typically, it could be fairly frightening. There's certainly a profound sense of danger, of uncertainty, of potentially life and death intensities, and there could be a quality of really of like not knowing what the result's going to be. And if there was, and there'd be a deep crisis of meaning, and also a collapse of the old identity structure, so that the things that you were used to securing yourself with, like, this is who I am, this is my identity, those would be undercut in this transformational ritual. And what I often say is, it seems to be crucial to this experience that you don't know the outcome of it. This uncertainty and not knowing is very important. And as a result, well, when you look at our own current situation collectively, there's a certain way in which modern humanity, or modern man as it used to be, kind of masculinized in the patriarchal tradition. And there's something to that masculine rendering of the whole human being. Like, modern man, in some sense, separated himself from nature and experienced his essential being as being in some way radically different from the rest of the cosmos. And now we find ourselves in a situation very much like an initiatory crisis. We are facing planetary mortality. We're going through a profound crisis of identity and a crisis of meaning. What's really important? Who are we really? How do human beings really fit into the Earth community? Where do we stand in the cosmos? Also, there's usually a facing of the shadow, like really like having to look really deeply at, like America having to look at things that it has kind of tried to sweep under the rug over the years, like the the treatment of Native Americans or the existence of slavery, and how much that has shaped our history right up to this day, and that suffering that people have suffered as a result of it, including suffered from the mainstream society not becoming sufficiently conscious of that shadow that it had been sweeping under the rug over these years. So all those things tend to come to the surface, like in what Stan Grof would call a spiritual emergency, where there's like an eruption of unconscious material that has to be faced. And one can actually feel like one's losing one's bearings, one's losing one's sanity, or like what's real. It can be a very big part of it. And as I like to say, the encounter with mortality and not knowing the outcome, being in a state of fundamental uncertainty, is so essential for a moral transformation to take place. Because, I mean, we all know that near-death experiences that there's nothing like a near-death experience for reconfiguring a person's moral values, like what's important in life. They have a near-death experience, they suddenly rethink everything. Like suddenly certain things that they thought were really important are just like trivial.
As I understand it, there's a thing called the Great Year Procession, and we kind of keep track of that. And inside that, we have myths that remember what time it is. So one of the myths that I think about a lot is the myth of the Phoenix, which signifies a 500-year period of time that is, things fall apart and then they rise up just like that. And I think that we're at the beginning of another 500-year cycle. And the way I read things, the period from 1480 to 1520, all the things that happened there became the agenda for the next 500 years.
That period, right around the turn of the 1500s, late 15th, early 16th century, which was the period when, you know, it's the High Renaissance, it's the beginning of the period of global exploration and imperial conquest that kind of radically opened up the entire planet to itself. It's also the period when Leonardo and Michelangelo and Raphael are creating their masterpieces. It's when Luther begins the breaking up of the Catholic Church with the and really all European Christendom goes through a huge revolution that helps move towards a more secular society. The scientific revolution is starting right at that time. It's right during those 40 years between 1480 and 1520 that you mentioned that Copernicus first gets the insight of the heliocentric universe. So in all those ways, we have a tremendous revolution of consciousness that is taking place, and really a revolution of the Earth community that has a deep so much was set in motion at that time that needs to be addressed now. Really, the entire modern project, which kind of gets underway at that point, has to be. We are now facing the consequences of, and needing to go through a kind of death and rebirth, I think, in order to move on to another mode of existence.
Well, so if that's the case, then it seems to me like that what we're going through right now has the same power or the potential to change, to define the future. For example, 20 years ago, if somebody had told me that we will never really seriously think about going to Mars, we wouldn't do that. But we're on our way, literally. And so you ask yourself the question, what does that do about our definition of who we are in the cosmos?
I think, Dane Rudhyar talked about our moving, he felt that the discovery of the outer planets were first Uranus in the 18th century, Neptune in the 19th, Pluto in the 20th, and now we're getting all these many more extra Neptunian planets, planetoids, bodies being discovered. I think in some sense what's going on is that kind of amniotic bubble of the solar system is being permeated, and we're starting to come into the potential of a more galactic consciousness.
Okay. And now that brings the next question.
That makes
it takes us 255, give or take, years to go all the way around the galaxy. And there must be some cycles that we will somehow or another discover going forward that relate to that journey as well.
Yes, there has been there has been work on this, and there does seem to be like an alignment between the winter solstice and the galactic center that we are crossing through at this time, over a couple of decade period. And the challenge, of course, is that all the astrological research that I've done that's in Cosmos and Psyche, for example, which is a kind of skimming off the top. There's a lot of correlations in Cosmos and Psyche, but it's about 1% of what could go there, and or 0.01%, but all of those correlations are within the last couple thousand years, 2,500 years roughly, going back to the axial age and the period of going back to Plato and Pythagoras and Sappho and the Buddha and so forth. Now, we have pretty decent historical records that get better and better from that point onwards. But when it comes to getting those kind of precise, like historical events and things, like what happened 25,000 years ago, 26,000 years ago, that was different that happened at 21,000 years. Those would be huge differences within our immediate time scale. But it's very hard for us. Like I want to, in the area of astrology and esoteric studies, at least my particular calling is to bring as much scholarly rigor as I can to noting the correlations, and that strengthens the bridge that we can build from the mainstream worldview to a new worldview that can start to open us up to the recognition that the universe is ensouled and deeply intelligent, and that we're participating in something that's much bigger, deeper, more vastly intelligent and sophisticated than we were giving it credit for when we thought that we were the, only conscious intelligence in the known universe. So that's my purpose in doing these kind of careful correlations. When we get past like the last 3,000 years and start moving into greater amplitude of time spans, that's it's tricky, because then you can sometimes get some intimations of what was going on, through the archaeological record, through the geological record, and so forth. But it's nothing like the density and richness of empirical data that I can work with in this shorter period. So I'm always, I do believe that those larger patterns exist. Certainly there are larger cycles that we are embedded in than we can see. But I also have to be very clear with the limits of my range of competence.
Well, one final thing. I believe you just said that the universe is ensouled. Is that what you said?
Yes.
Could you talk a little bit more about that? Just take us there and let us look at it.
Sure. Well, I think we all have a sense that probably anybody listening to this podcast would have a sense of that they each of them has a psyche, which is another word for soul. And the psyche, the soul, it has depth. It has it is a locus of meanings and purposes. It has moral and spiritual aspirations and ideals. There is a quality of interiority, of being a subject. Like, I'm looking out at the world right now and I see the tree outside the window here. And I am looking at the screen here and talking to my friends, my interlocutors, interviewers. And there's a me in here that is a subject and has interiority. That's the soul. That's this. It's both consciousness and also more that's even underneath the consciousness, but that is somehow informing the consciousness from its depths, and that is expressed in dreams, for example, or in visionary experiences, or in artistic inspiration, or in revelatory awakenings, as there one's walking through nature and has a kind of, could be a spiritual opening of some kind, or in deep relationship where we feel our soul, two souls are meeting in deep relationship. So those are all examples of the soul in human life. And I'm convinced, and I'm not alone, that the entire universe is ensouled in that way. And that it's a very recent and rather provincial superstition on the part of the modern mind to think that we human beings are the only game in town that are ensouled. We are expressions of the cosmos and of the earth. We grew out of the earth's own life systems and out of the cosmos's own life systems. And our consciousness is in a very fundamental way the cosmos's consciousness in us in human form. But it's not only in us. That consciousness is in that cedar tree out there. It's in that squirrel going by. It's in all things. Everything's breathing together, and that recognition, first of all, helps us break out of the ecological nightmare that we've created when we objectify the whole world and say, it doesn't have any soul, it's there for our exploitation, we can do what we want with it. And that's gonna come back and bite us as it is.
Big time.
And so we, in some sense, have to go through a humbling so that we can. First, there'll be a deep destabilization, a decentering, where we get dethroned from being at the top of the mountaintop that we thought we were, top of the pyramid. But then, the beauty of the spiritual death rebirth process is that once one has, gone through that fall, that collapse, that dethroning, you connect to a foundational depth that is coming out of something bigger than you, and you lose your specialness that you used to have, thinking that you're the only game in town, or that man is the measure of all things, etc. And you lose that. You become, and we all do this when we face death, like, oh, I'm going to die too, just like everybody else. There's nothing special about me in that way. I'm going to have to accept that too. But the other side of the death rebirth process is connecting to a deeper ground of being in which you again experience your specialness, but not as the only superior being in a world of inferior beings, but rather your specialness comes from the fact that you are grounded in the universe itself, this divine cosmos, this ensouled, intelligent, vast being that is in you and living through you. And what makes you special is that there's only one Chuck Robinson, and there's only one Karen and one Clay and one Rick that has our particular qualities. And this is what Jung was talking about with individuation. Jung's individuation process, in part, was something that was part of how we, in the journey of our life, kind of separate ourselves out from the collective and become unique and go our own way and individuate in that way. But the deeper fulfillment of individuation involves a dying to just a kind of naive, separate identity and a reconnection to the archetypal ground of being. And at that point, one experiences oneself, the individuation is a flowering from the universal. Instead of us each being separate potted plants in our own pots, we're all in, our roots are in the earth, and we share that earth. We have a common ground, but we have each flowered in individual ways. There's Karen as the lovely rose that she is, and there's Chuck and Clay, and each of us has our own form of flowering, and so that's one way of seeing how we break out of the disenchanted universe. To be a disenchanted universe means it lacks any soul quality, it lacks any interiority, it lacks intrinsic meaning and purpose. I mean, the mainstream worldview that we inherited from 19th, 20th century science, natural science, is a disenchanted one in which we're randomly evolving. There's no intrinsic meaning or purpose in the universe. Anything that we think is meaningful or purposeful is coming just from human beings as a kind of courageous project on our part, but in a vast, we're in a vast universe that is ultimately meaningless.
Yep. And
the joy of dying to that old identity, that's why they call it the Grateful Dead. It's true. I mean, the gratefulness that one feels having died to that old separative identity is to awaken to the fact that you are a part of something much bigger, and that universe is in fact not disenchanted, but it is ensouled and it's inspirited, and it's profoundly intelligent.
But I want to ask you something that everybody wants to ask you, and I don't want the answer everybody wants. But
so this has to be a uniquely tailored answer.
Yeah.
Especially, yeah.
But here's the question. Here we are in 2020 in America. It's almost over, and everybody knows that something profound is happening.
When you say it's almost over, what's the it?
The year.
Oh, okay.
The experience.
Got it.
The plague, all the things that we think are going to be over, not to mention the political situation that we've been through, many of us are not happy with. But it seems like it's time to say, where are we and what's around the corner, without putting you on the spot? Where are we? Where are we going? Right. What's right down the street there?
Right. Well, we've got a lot of work still to do. And I mean, just in terms of, I don't know how much your audience, for example, carries a kind of easy recognition of the, if I say there's a Saturn-Pluto conjunction, and then there's a triple conjunction with Jupiter that's been going on this year, and there's certain things that will shift during this next year. We've been in the peak years of the this year, last year and this year have been the peak years of the Saturn-Pluto conjunction. It will still be an orb next year, but starting to shift into something new. And this is by, I've done a lot of research, which is in Cosmos and Psyche, that kind of tracks out how many degrees on each side of the exact alignment there tend to be archetypally appropriate events and cultural phenomena that reflect that aspect. So we have a sense that for these really big outer planet conjunctions and oppositions that we're going through, you have a full 10 to 15 degree orb, is what we call it, on each side of exact. You see it in the 1960s, for example, with the Uranus-Pluto conjunction, and that tremendous awakening of kind of creative and rebellious and transformational energies that took place. It didn't happen just the year that they were conjoined exact in 65, 66. It, really from about 1960 to the early, like 72, that whole period was cooking with, countercultural activity, with everything from the civil rights movement to the feminist movement, the environmental movement, the rock and roll, the student rebellions, anti-war. It was so that we're in a similar period now where, astrologers have known for quite a while that the year we're just ending, 2020, and going into this next year for sure, is a very rare convergence of four outer planets: Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Pluto. Neptune has been sextile the triple conjunction of Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto, which I think has been a very helpful stabilizing impulse archetypally. I think it's helped give a kind of spiritual balance amidst the tumult and darkness of the time. So astrologers have known for a while that this year was going to be, no picnic, and it certainly hasn't been. Really one of the most challenging years of, I suspect, any of our lifetimes, collectively. And we all feel it individually, no matter how, whether one's on the front lines or isolated in one's house. You can't escape the zeitgeist. It's in there. Okay, so the kinds of things that I suspect we'd be looking at, a great massive effort has been exerted over collectively in the United States, for example, politically, in terms of social awareness after the Black Lives Matter protests or during those protests. These were enormous expressions of both facing the shadow side of the U.S., like the structural racism or the ways in which our government seem to be becoming corrupted and put in service of put in service of very selfish ideals that or goals that were counter to the American ideals that we thought had been the glue that kept us all together. And there's been a great confrontation with that over this year, and a great mobilization of effort to try to shift that. And to a great extent, I think that it has been successful. That Jupiter-Pluto conjunction that's been going on all this year, and we're just starting to move. As we move into the next year, that moves out of alignment. But we've been kind of gifted by that conjunction all this year. There's a potential there for profound spiritual regeneration, and like going into the depths of the underworld and arising like the phoenix, the metaphor or the symbol that you brought up before, because Jupiter elevates and Pluto goes into the depths, into the descent. Take somebody like Beethoven, who's got the Jupiter-Pluto conjunction. His music goes into the depths and into the heights, and there's a magnificent kind of moral power to his music. And that's in a way what we've been watching. I remember the day of the election, I felt like this was like D-Day in some ways, this masses of energies in a vast conflict with the whole world watching and kind of global consequences at stake. And we've been through that, and that's, I think, it's really like the aspect of the death rebirth mystery, and we've kind of been living it through. Now, as we go into next year, there's a lot of tensions in the air. Saturn moves into the square to Uranus, and that's going to go on for a couple more years after that, quite strongly. Saturn square Uranus can bring a real conflict between the impulse for change and the impulse for and the resistance to change. It can bring about civil disturbances. It can bring separative energies. I'm concerned about, say, the number of people who have been locked into homes and sometimes relationships that have not thrived well under the claustrophobic circumstances, and that there could be during this next year, more than the usual kind of breaks in order to be free of that constraint. And I think our country it's a volatile combination. I think our country will have to face some dicey situations. My longer term sense of just looking at the United States, for those who are watching this or listening to this, who are citizens of the US, we've been going through the Pluto return these recent years, and that's been a huge part, that kind of descent into the underworld, and that deep transformation and that facing of the shadow. The Saturn-Pluto conjunction really brought it to focus, but the larger Pluto return, the United States has never had a Pluto return before. This is its first one. It's a 250-year cycle, and human beings don't get Pluto returns. We don't live that long, but the U.S. is getting it, and wow, have we? It's basically like Hades kind of swallowed the soul of America. There, we're kind of having to face that. But the beauty of that myth is that there's Hades is the underworld within which deep transformation alone can happen in some ways. And for those who have the courage to go into those depths and rise above it and through it, can be very much empowered. So as we move into this 2020s, year by year, we're going to be moving into a new outer planet aspect of Uranus trine Pluto for much of the 2020s. That tends to bring a greater sense of confluence between the impulse for change and the deeper evolutionary drives of the Pluto. And we've been through these last few years the hard aspects involving these planets, which tends to bring about much more tension producing crises and really overwhelming circumstances. And where we're moving is to much more, not right away, but as we get into 2023, 24, 25, we're getting into the trine. The trine is a harmonious, confluent alignment between these two planets. And then finally, when we get to 2027, 28, we're going to go through our Uranus return, which will be our third one. The first one happened at the time of the, so 1776 is our birth chart, so to speak. And then the first Uranus return, it's about an 84-year cycle, takes place during the Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation, a new birth of freedom. You see it, that's the Uranus Promethean principle of a new birth, a new freedom, a new awakening, great potential for that. Then the next one happened at the end of World War II, in the beginning of the American century, as it's sometimes called, and a lot of emancipatory movements that it has supported. And now this is going to be our third one. And it gives me hope that as dark and critical as our, and even apocalyptic as our recent era has been, and I don't think we're not through it by any means. So much depends on how we confront the climate crisis. I mean, that's the mega drama that everything else is taking place within. We're losing, millions of species, the biodiversity of the planet. It's an enormous catastrophic situation, which our political and corporate leaders have been avoiding terribly and postponing the necessary things we need to do. If we can step up to this, I'm hopeful that this decade could be a very life-enhancing one. But we're not out of the woods yet, and certainly the next couple of years are going to be ones where we do need to keep our wits about us and our courage and heart with us.
So I've been meeting for 8.5 years every week with a circle of men, and I've got a large network out there, and I've been across the U.S. last year, and then I was in Africa for a while. And this overall feeling that I've gotten, it kind of relates to what you were just saying, is that this downward pressure on us, this that's brought on by the patriarchy, that's impacting both women and men, that there's a spark of goodness that we have. I think it's a divine spark, and I keep getting this sense that this is this downward pressure, that this is going to come up, that it's coming out. And I believe that it's the essence of love. Now, me personally, I have a hard time getting my arms around the concept of love. It's kind of like grabbing Jell-O for me. Mm-hmm. But the notion of compassion, of love in action, really rings true. And I've been on this track that I really feel like there's a new compassionate male that's emerging. And I want to believe that he's emerging as a new archetype. The notion that of the king, warrior, magician, lover, absolutely valid. But my sense is that tying those four together, for example, running through that is the essence of compassion. And that if we point to that and say, this burn that you've got inside of you, this emptiness feeling, is actually a spark of divine light that's trying to get out.
Mhm.
And compassion is the way that we connect with one another.
I agree with you. I think you've described it beautifully, and I see a lot of signs of that. Compassion, just in terms of biological evolution, we are shaped so much. We're made possible by parental care, starting with maternal care. And the whole mammalian lineage becomes capable of bringing forth new levels of imagination, intelligence, and care, all as a result of what starts as the mother's care of the little mammals from 200 million years ago, and it just keeps developing more and more, and it becomes. I think one reason to bring up maternity is I think the more men are, for example, present at their children's births and are also take on a major part of the caring of their children. That's going to play a huge role, because that by the kind of patriarchal division of women are in the home and take care of the children, men go out into the world and do their jobs and bring home the bacon and so forth. That rigid allotment of roles cuts off men from certain activities that could actually help them get in touch with and cultivate that capacity for care and compassion.
That's the lunar masculine.
That's the lunar masculine.
That's the lunar masculine. And, Howard Teich,
yes,
had a conversation with Howard.
Okay.
And he said the lunar leads and the solar executes.
Yeah, Howard, we're old friends, and he is the one who started the ball rolling in terms of recognizing how we need to, make a differentiation between the solar lunar polarity and the masculine feminine polarity.
Mm-hmm.
They overlap, but to collapse one into the other is basically what patriarchy did.
Right.
And as we've a number of Jungian feminists have embraced this, like Susan Rowland, for example, Susan Griffin, John Beebe, another Jungian, and I see this working out on a whole level of human civilization, because we've in many ways been driven by a solar masculine archetypal complex, man, and that has involved a suppression of the lunar masculine, of the solar feminine,
mm-hmm.
and while it allows the lunar feminine, it has also devalued it. It's
Right.
not as important as the solar masculine in this kind of archaic hierarchy. So to get these, I really think what's happening in each of our individual lives, getting in touch with compassion, to get back to your original point, which often happens through compassion is to suffer together, to experience together, and compassion is often made possible only when one has experienced some suffering of one's own that allows one to say, oh, in this other person, I've been there, I feel for you. I mean, the way Biden is able to speak with such authenticity about the people not at the Thanksgiving Day table, and I know how hard that must be. He can just say it with complete the silence, the gnawing grief, and so forth. He's not making that up. It's like coming right from his depths. Well, that's where his capacity for compassion, where he can, from then on, somebody tells him about a similar loss, and then he wants their phone number and is going to call up and check in on how they're doing through their grieving process with great selflessness. So I totally agree with you. Both the individual coming into this awakening of the potential for compassion, which partly requires us to go into our own suffering, and then collectively I mean, for us to realize, say, what suffering Western civilization and modern civilization has caused for the rest of the Earth community, other human beings, other cultures, but also animals of non-human animals that have suffered as a result of our actions, or the forests or the ocean and so forth. There could be, in a sense, that type of spiritual transformation is going to be required, I think, for us to move into a promised land.
Rick, just listening to you and your careful and your very important set of ideas is just, I'm walking away already feeling better about the situation that we're in than I've felt in the last 4 or 5 years, just now. And I think that our listener is going to have some of that too. And just the chance of spending this time with you is a real blessing to me and to Karen.
It is so much a pleasure to just be in your presence and
Yes,
share your knowledge with us. We're really, really grateful. We've followed you all these years, and you are a champion in our hearts.
Well, thank you. I feel very blessed by your support and your feelings about me and my work, and it's really been an honor to be in conversation with you in this way.
thank you.
I'm glad that you feel that those who tune into this may be able to get something from it as well.
Absolutely.
They will.
Rick, thank you so very much.
Amen.
That's great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bless you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Rick.
Bless you.
Thanks, Rick.
Bye-bye.
Wow. Bless you.